Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who has joined us online or will late watch this video. We have the pleasure to welcome you to the second day of the European Union Czech Presidency high-level event on strengthening multilateralism through science, hosted together with the United Nations Environment Programme. The Geneva Environment Network is hosting today's panel discussion on science to zero pollution actions. This topic is of importance for International Geneva as a global hub for the governance of hazardous substances. Today's event is moderated by Luc Bass, Head of Coordination and Strategy at the European Environment Agency. Before I give the floor to Luc, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of this panel discussion will be made available on the webpage of this event. The link is being shared in the chat. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box, and this will help us feed the discussion. With that, Luc, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana. And yes, welcome everyone. Good morning. It's a big pleasure to be moderating this really interesting panel with really distinguished participation. And it, of course, underlines the close collaboration with the Czech Presidency so far and still going on and continuing, and with the long-standing collaboration with UNEP. I've heard and I've seen some echoes from the meeting yesterday, which had some really interesting ideas and proposals and thoughts on how to accelerate and to scale up the better connection between science and policy, and making sure that policy and the actions follow what science informs. I think the diplomacy discussion and the cooperation discussion is now complemented with a focus on the zero pollution actions, so we can go a bit potentially more in some of the concrete opportunities, but also challenges, and to make that all work in the context of multilateralism and, of course, having that clear collaboration. Yeah, moving towards a pollution-free planet is, of course, a collective responsibility. It's clear that it has huge benefits if we do even better for nature and people. And in the past, we've seen successes when it comes to pollution. It was also the first element of environmental attention before we even looked into climate change and biodiversity. And so we have successes, the Minamata Convention and Montreal Protocol being good examples. But of course, we also see that many of the multilateral agreements are not yet delivering what they can. And therefore, we also have to see how we can avoid mistakes from the past. And I think one very obvious one where science was not followed, although it was known for decades, is the asbestos pollution, for example, and the effects on health. And I think today we will be very often referring to the health nexus, because that, of course, is where the immediate urgency is because of these negative health effects on people. And therefore, I think in the panel, and with the panel in front of us, which I will now quickly introduce, I think we will be able to touch upon many of these points, and hopefully we will come with some interesting conclusions that also the policymakers can take at heart. In our panel, we will start with Alphonse Muya. He's a member of the UNEP Children and Youth Major Group Global Steering Committee, and it's great to have you, because I think the voice from youth is critical, and we hope we will be able to also to respond to some of the comments that you will be making shortly. Then we have Andrea Hinwood, the Chief Scientist of UNEP, Maria Neira, the Director for Public Health and Environmental and Social Determinants in the World Health Organization. We have Joachim Dugenio, Policy Advisor on Zero Pollution in the European Commission. Then we have Miroslav Havranek. He is the Director for the Czech Environmental Agency, and of course representing the presidency here, the Czech Presidency of the European Council. And then we have Patricia Heidegger, who represents, let's say, the NGO stakeholders, and will also add the global context to all of this. Just a few words before I hand over to Alphonse. This session, of course, aims to look at there's so many things that we need to focus on, and what could be absolute priority issues where we are still lacking the necessary action, and where we can accelerate because they're urgently to be addressed. We will try to see how this all links up as well, and how this makes us holistically sense and where the linkages are. And I think many of those linkages were already kind of addressed yesterday when the pollution element came on board. And then, of course, to see what are the enablers to reach what we need to reach. As I said before, we have had successes in the past and still ongoing with the multilateral agreements that exist, but there are many where we're still challenged. Hope is, of course, existing with the establishment or the discussions on the establishment for a legal instrument to tackle plastic pollution, which now I think starts to become an emission problem more than even a waste problem. And I think that is another way of tackling it. We will address science-based targets, but I think we will have to be a bit dare to be provocative, that we see in some of the overall agreements there might be science-based targets, and the Paris Agreement being a good example. But unfortunately, very often they are not science-based because they would be much more stringent. There's a lot of knowledge known. We know that. We will hear it today. There's a lot of knowledge that can spur into action, but that we don't see happen yet. And even then, we don't need all the knowledge even for action. We need to always keep in mind that there is also something like the precautionary principle where action can be needed. And then finally, and the last point from me before I hand over to Alphonse, it's very much about also how we or the science community is communicating. And I remember a very interesting book that I just put on the table here is a book by Randy Olson, who is a scientist, an ocean marine scientist, and who wrote a book, and that I'll leave it, Don't Be Such a Scientist. And I think what he meant is, of course, that there is often a problem with communication. So with that, I'll hand over to Alphonse for his keynote from the youth perspective. Over to you, Alphonse.
Thank you so much, Lucas. I'm glad to join in this conversation. So I'm Alphonse Muya from Kenya. I work with an organization called the Catholic Network for Environmental Sustainability in Africa, and I'm a member of the UNEP Youth Constituency Global Steering Committee. I'd like first to thank the Czech Presidency of the EU Council, together with the UNEP, for convening this meeting, and I have the pleasure to address you all. Just as you said, Lucas, I think I'm visible and audible enough. All right, thank you. So as you said, several literature sources tell us that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and out of all this period, human species have just been around for around 230,000 years. 99% of these years, humans have been predominantly relying on hunting and gathering to get food, a practice that impacted very little on the environment, and the environment would rapidly recover from these impacts. The rise of agriculture and industry mounted pressure on energy demand, bringing in reliance on fossil fuels, which have been the cause of disrupting the whole climate system, causing pollution, and eventually raising concerns about sustainable ways of life in the wake of environmental movements around 50 to 60 years ago. Pollution was one of the first indicators of a strained relationship between humanity and nature, as documented by earlier authors on this topic, such as Rachel Carlson. And right now, chemical and waste pollution, mainly air pollution, remains one of the biggest threats to healthy and sustainable planet for all, and especially the children and youth. We are now unwittingly internalizing pollutants in our bodies, and clearly children and future generations are at the cliff of facing the worst impacts of the rising toxicity levels if we don't get the assignment to curb pollution right. Human beings have come to realize that they bear a unique potential to holistically change the functioning of the planet, and now scientific approaches must be on the front line of the efforts to combat the three planetary crises, alongside strengthening the multilateral system to effectively bring the community of nations together in addressing the biggest challenges facing humanity today. You all know that 2022 enters in the list of landmark years in the history of environmental multilateralism for delivering a successful UNEA 5.2 UNEP at 50 and Stockholm plus 50 international meeting, which proved that having the youth at the center of multilateral system is imperative to effective multilateralism. The Chemicals and Waste Working Group of the UNEP Youth Constituency has been working closely with the CPR to follow through implementation of the 14 resolutions adopted in UNEA 5.2, including Resolution 5/8 that proposes establishment of science policy panel to contribute further to the sound management of chemicals and waste and to prevent pollution. And now we are looking for funding to mobilize a youth delegation system to the upcoming in-person open-ended working group 1.2 meeting on this subject that will be held next year in Bangkok. The youth are engaged actively in advocating for formulation of effective policies that helps us to address these challenges, but are also active in science and research to come up with innovative approaches at local levels. And in that regard, I invite the global community to invest towards building technical capacity of youth, especially from the developing countries, so that they can be able to help their countries and the world by extension leapfrog the dirty and polluted phase of development. Everyone thought that with about 30 years would address the three planetary crises of climate change, nature, and pollution, but we have stagnated as the multilateral system has often exhibited inadequacy of some very key ingredients to catalyze action, including indifference to science. And that is what we must now get very right. Looking forward to the SDG Summit and the Summit of the Future, the Youth Constituency has already commenced a series of global consultations to effectively inform these processes, and empowering youth to tame the pollution crisis will form a central pillar of this process. I thank you so much, Luke Bass, and I am very glad to have given this keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you, Alphonse, and thank you very much for, I think, reminding us all of the bigger context as well, which I think you alluded to, which is the pressure from consumption that is outplaying all the marginal improvements that we have seen in the past. And of course, it's great to see how youth is also really gearing up and preparing into the processes, which are really crucial. And then your call for more support, especially in developing countries, for technical capacity, that is well noted. Thanks so much. We'll now head forward into the panel discussion, and I will just inform you how the format for this will work. So we will have short introductions from each of the panelists. Meanwhile, I think you can already in the chat provide some questions, either generally or to one of the specific panelists. And I'm also inviting the panelists themselves to come up with some questions to their colleagues. And if all of that wouldn't be enough, of course, I have some questions up my sleeve when we come to a point to keep on discussing. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce now Andrea, who will, Andrea Inwood, the Chief Scientist at UNEP. She will give us a bit of an overview with a presentation. I think this is the one presentation that you will be seeing at this in this panel, but it's a great overview to set the scene on the different challenges that exist and the emerging issues. So Andrea, over to you.
Thank you, Luke, and thank you everyone and for the organisers for inviting me today, and thanks Alphonse for actually setting us up so well. So I just want to give a couple of slides just to give an indication of the nature of the problem, and importantly where science has been used to actually highlight the issues. So if we have a look at the first slide, I'm just giving, this is a really, what do you call it, cherry picking of issues. So I think air pollution's already been mentioned. We know this is one of the most significant issues for human health and for the environment. And 92% of the global population is exposed to PM 2.5 levels greater than the WHO guideline of 10, which of course has been reduced. Without policy intervention, we will see an increase of 50% by 2030. And so there's a lot of work we need to do. So we understand the science of air pollution. We've got good measurements in place. We understand the impact on the human population. We've got a very good handle on sources. Science has actually helped with that, and also in terms of the interventions. I'm just throwing up a few other things. Pesticide use per area of cropland region is also increasing in some parts of the world. And of course, we know some of these pesticides are making their way into waterways, but they're also making their way into the human population around areas as well. And so we've had some success in that area, and I'll show you that, but we've also got some increasing problems with a variety of pesticides that the full implications of their impact on human health and ecosystems is yet to be known. We know about plastics. We've got the INC meeting day 2 today, and we know that we're projected to reach over 1,100 million tonnes of plastics. We know they're complex mixtures. They come with chemicals. When they break down, those chemicals end up in the environment, etc. Next slide, please. I'm necessarily going through this quick because I wasn't meant to have any slides at all. So I just wanted to say that water quality is a significant issue globally, and that we know there are many parts of the world where there is not safe drinking water, and of course that has implications for ecosystems and human health. That we have arsenic in groundwater is still a significant health issue in many parts of the world, something we've known about, we call a legacy issue, but we still haven't necessarily resolved that. We've got issues of waste, e-waste, and again, global plastic production, solid municipal waste, etc., all of which are increasing and are projected to increase over time. Next slide, please. But we also have the science that has helped us with a good understanding of some of our old persistent organic pollutants, where we have introduced bans and regulations which have seen significant declines of persistent organics, both in the environment but also in the human population. So we've actually got an evidence base, and we can show this with, and you can see from these images on the slide now, where you've got DDT in Africa, where we've implemented bans and we've got significant reductions. So we have success, and we've seen that with lead in petrol, Montreal Protocol, in terms of ozone depleting substances, etc. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to say, in terms of success and the science driving action, we have an open-ended working group that we'll be meeting in Bangkok in January, which is looking towards establishing a science policy panel for the sound management of chemicals and waste and pollution prevention. And we also have an INC for plastics pollution, which is on foot now, where we're developing a treaty. So what we have is a mix of science that has helped informed us about the plethora of pollution problems, which we're sometimes calling the invisible problem. And we also have the science of solutions, and we can see the success of measures that we take. Many of the issues we're dealing with are country and region specific, and we need to take some of those nuances into account. And we need to actually look at how we integrate these issues. Alphonse outlined the triple planetary crises. Chemicals, waste and pollution is interrelated with climate change and also with biodiversity and nature loss. We need to be considering these issues in an integrated way if we're actually going to be able to solve some of the issues that we have. So there are many, many more things that I could talk about at this point in time, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it there, and I look forward to discussing these issues with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. And thanks very much for this kind of on the one hand, hopeful message. On the other hand, maybe sometimes also sobering, because we do see that that in many places we don't reach what we want, but we had successes, and I think we can and should learn from those successes. And of course, how everything is integrated and connected, and I think we'll come back to that later. Maybe one thing I also picked up from the graphs, and another element that would be interesting to pick up after the introductory remarks, is how pollution is also very unevenly distributed. Huh? And we have done these reports at the European Environment Agency for Europe, where we see that it is even a big difference between East and Western Europe, not in all of East and all of West, but we see a clear interlinkage with the capacity of dealing with things and then seeing what the pollution is. So that's something that I think we see also at the global level, and therefore multilateralism becomes key. Maria Neira, the Director for Public Health and Environmental and Social Determinants in the World Health Organization, is up next. And I understood that you would want to focus a bit on the air pollution element, of course. And there is an interesting discussion, I think, also between the European Union and the World Health Organization on these famous standards. But Maria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Luke, and congratulations, UNEP, and of course the Czech Presidency for organizing this. I was very privileged to be attending a meeting in Prague last week where we were discussing with the European Commission and the Czech Presidency, and of course UNEP participation was very strong as well on the air quality standards and how we can move on that. But look, you gave me the floor for a few minutes and you asked us to be a little bit provocative. So with your permission, allow me to do that.
Yeah,
I think
with my full support.
Great, fantastic. Well, small provocative, but maybe we can scale up later. The thing is the following. The topic is from science to policy, and this is our dream. I mean, when we work on public health, and I suppose on environmental issues as well, the dream is to have enough science to be able to make policy recommendations. The less stimulating part comes when you have enough science, you have policy recommendations, and still you feel very much frustrated because the impact of those recommendations and hello, can you hear me?
Perfect. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. The frustration I was saying comes when you have enough science, you have right recommendation, and still you are not advancing, at least in terms of public health. So my question to all of us is that what should be the ideal weight of science that will allow us to justify a more aggressive, more proactive, and hopefully more impactful package of interventions? The second reflection here is take the case of air pollution. Everybody is aware of the estimates of WHO about the 7 million premature deaths caused every year by exposure to pollution. UNEP has been extremely supportive and strong behind this statement, and all the interventions that we know that we need to put in place if we want to reduce that horrible damage and impact on our human health, and of course affecting the environment as well. We know as well how much this overlap with the climate change, and therefore will give us, again, a very strong argument, health argument, to accelerate action on tackling the causes of climate change, and therefore obtaining those enormous benefits for health. And we are still there. We are still at the COP27 discussing whether or not we need to phase out the fossil fuels that are responsible for that. So my call to all of you is to maybe the way to measure successes. I know that sometimes we are very proud when we have conventions on international protocols, agreements signed, but probably we need to go a little bit further on defining the way of success. And my suggestion here is to measure with a very strong indicator, which is health. I mean, if we cannot prove that we have reduced the number of deaths caused by exposure to air pollution, I think that we can sign as many agreements as we want. We are not successful. Similar with the Paris Treaty. Paris Treaty can be one of the biggest public health treaties if implemented. Unfortunately, it's not the case yet. So my point will be, we have science which is enough at the moment to propose very strong policy recommendations for action, like the air quality standards and many others that we have done a compendium with UNEP, by the way, and other UN agencies. And then we need to move and quantify the health benefits, using those health benefits for moving and promoting more action and motivating more action. Because as you rightly say, look, health is the one that will give us this sense of urgency. People will definitely understand. So those are my initial remarks to open a little bit the dialogue, and I hope to have the opportunity to interact later on with the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Also to remind us of what is actually really needed, and also to see that there is, for some reason, and I think is one of the elements here is to try to even better understand the reasons. Much of what we know, of course, has to do with political will, but then it's about how to get the political will on the right side. And I think the health argument obviously is one that is being used, it should be used, and should be considered and to be seen as the hyper urgent. One could even argue that if you look at the the immensity of the challenge on climate change to reduce the CO2 emissions at the scale that is really needed, and the scale of the change of land use needed for biodiversity are extremely systemic and very complex. Pollution, of course, is also complex, but there is a lot of low-hanging fruit that we are not yet even tackling, and that is what is really concerning, because it's very often point source, and therefore can be tackled if the regulations are fully implemented. And I also remember implementation as the keyword from your intervention. Joachim, you're up next. You have noticed, of course, that I haven't spoken a lot about the EU context. I completely leave that to you, and to give a bit of the background there, and then also to see how that all fits into the global and the multilateral context as well. So Joachim, over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation and for UNEP and the Czech Presidency to organizing this. It's relatively easy for me to speaking after Alphonse and Andrea and Maria, because a lot of the things that I wanted to say is already been said, and I fully agree with the scene setting from them. I want to start briefly by saying that this meeting now, this discussion comes at a perfect time for us as well, because at the EU level we are discussing these issues also very intensively. You know that we have set out under the European Green Deal a zero pollution ambition for a non-toxic environment, and within that a 2050 vision of a world that can basically be without the pollution, and pollution meaning with levels of pollution that do not harm the health and our ecosystems, and that also do not have a planetary capacity exceeded. So for us, this long-term perspective has already helped to trigger a new dialogue, a new discussion. And within that, we have set out a number of targets for 2030, a number of quantitative targets, which are exactly the type of issues that Andrea was mentioning: air quality for human health, air quality pollution, air quality for protecting ecosystems, noise pollution, pesticides, nutrients, plastics pollution, waste. So this is the agenda that very much is aligned with the discussions at the global level. And where my main message would be is that what we are very clear is that we have a lot of evidence, so we can act already. So there is no shortage of evidence to prevent us from acting. So that is why we have moved now into the operational mode to come up with quite a large number of proposals that address pollution. Air quality was already mentioned. We have recently published a proposal for new air quality legislation in Europe, of course taking into account what WHO has worked on and recommended. We are also working on water, on pesticides, on waste issues, also being discussed this week, for example. So we are really looking at this more and more in an integrated way, because first of all, we realized when working on the zero pollution agenda that whilst working on single topics, there are always strong interconnections between them. And this has to be reflected in the policy making. So I think from the design and from the conceptual approach, we had a very, very strong effort over the last 2 or 3 years to really, even more so than before, connect the dots and have an integrated policy making, and see how, for instance, the climate agenda can also have positive co-benefits for pollution, how the circular economy agenda can be better used to drive a clean economy as well, and how biodiversity and pollution control can work hand in hand. We hope, of course, that now in COP15, that this will be very prominent, and I think we need a strong signal and a strong message there on pollution as well. What I wanted to say as well is that we are now preparing with, it's actually the European Environment Agency and the Joint Research Center who are preparing a new report that is coming out soon. It will be published on the 8th of December, and we will put the link in the chat in a minute. And there we are trying to put together the latest knowledge in science that we have. And here, once again, I say we have enough evidence to act, but that doesn't mean we should not use this time in parallel to improve our understanding, to improve our science. And it's precisely to help us to convince more and more everybody, because ultimately it's an ongoing dialogue, and we have to use the science, we have to use the evidence to convince those who are not yet convinced. And so it's a process that goes hand in hand. And so I think this report will be very interesting, and we have tried, and I think that we can still do better. It's not only to look at the, let's say, the EU domestic situation. We have, of course, made some progress in the EU. There's still quite a lot of challenges to be solved. But I think we more and more realize is that these interconnections with the global health, with the global ecosystems is very important. The import and export of pollution is something we want to dig into more. For example, from an EU perspective, we are well aware that actions we do in EU have consequences around the world, and we just don't know enough about it. And the other thing is we cannot solve Europe's pollution problems without collaborating with our neighbors, for example, in the Mediterranean, in the east, where, of course, at the moment it's very tragic to see what is happening there. That certainly doesn't, also from pollution point of view, make us very, very positive about what we can do. But I think there is really plenty of dialogue necessary so that we use where we are to do better in the future. And I want to say that I'm really super happy to know that the Science Policy Panel is now getting started at the UN level. We are very supportive of that. That the Global Treaty on Plastics is making headway. So all of these things for us are super important. And for us, the main message is action is possible. We have enough evidence, but let's use the time also to get our arguments even stronger and digest it in such a way that we convince those who are not yet convinced. Because I think we have the right arguments. We just have to use them in such a way that we can get everybody on board. So that would be a little bit from my side, my contribution. Thank you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Joachim. Thanks also for reminding the audience about the report that is being launched next week. Indeed, I think it's going to be of a lot of interest for many working in this field, but also to see how from that report then we will be able to translate the messages, as you just indicated, in such a way that they will be heard louder, and action would actually come from it more immediately. Yes, the Zero Action Pollution Plan in the EU, I think, is top notch as it stands. But as you already indicated, a lot of this pollution from the consumption in Europe and I think in other developed countries is somehow exported, because much of the products we consume are causing pollution elsewhere. And I think that is where the biggest knowledge gap may be at the moment. As you rightfully say, we know more than enough, and I think everybody now has already said it in the panel, more than enough to know what we have to do, and we're still not doing it. So it means that we have to get our arguments even smarter to those that make the decisions. Next is Miroslav Havranek, the director of the Czech Environmental Information Agency. And Miroslav, you will provide a few insights and also link it a bit to the presidency activity. So over to you, Miroslav.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the for this opportunity to be part of this panel. I had two things in mind I wanted to say, but listening to my predecessor speakers, I kind of have three now. First is I would like to follow up what Alphonse was saying about human species, and we are here on this planet for such a time. The thing is that last month we celebrated 8 billion people on this planet, and according to UN predictions, at the half of the century there will be 10 billion people in mid-estimate and 12 billion in high estimate. So we are now looking on prospect that our population will increase by 20 or maybe up to 33% compared to nowadays. And all this population needs to eat, all this population needs to consume, they need food, they need energy, they need place to live. And this is immense challenge for not only planet to sustain us, but also for human society and technology to actually be able to cope with that. We see it in many countries where the population tripled or quadrupled in past 60 to 80 years. And this is immense social challenge for the countries to be able to sustain. And how does it link with the population? With pollution. Well, not all pollution is created equal, I would say, because some pollution is really undesired leftover of our production of our society metabolism, like we had mentioned microplastics, and we have mentioned, for example, air pollution, CO2 emission from burning fossil fuels. That's for clear pollution. But there are some pollution that we consider pollution if it's excessive, like fertilizers or pesticides. But on the other hand, these are the exact chemicals that allow us to be there 8 or 10 billion people. According to some estimates, there are now 3 to 4 billion people more if there would not be industrial fertilizers. So we need to be really careful how we think about, reducing pollution in terms of growing population. I know it sounds very environmental, but it's humane, because if you are arguing, to abandon all stuff that allow us to sustain population of 8 billion, then you are actually arguing, for the population to decrease, which is something that might be sustainable in long term, but it's really hard to argue in the face with people. And this was my first take. I really didn't want it to do, but it's important to keep it in mind. The second take is about how science can help us with that, because what we are really trying here is to square circle, and we really walking very narrow path between, to do good, to reduce pollution, to improve health condition, to actually diminish possibility to sustain what is now in the eyes of environment very excessive planetary population. So we need to have the best research we can have. And I would call here for integrated research, because many times we see, narrow field, like epidemiologists say, okay, this is dangerous, but then we need follow-up steps to see, okay, how does it influence economy? How does it influence society? What people will think about it? Are there other impacts that will spread and spread throughout the system? Because we are not living in a linear world, we are living in feedback world. And every action that and every strain we put in the system has some feedback loops built in. So it means that sometimes simple answer are not the best answer. Actually, most of the time they are not best answer. And this goes to my third point, and this is the interaction between science and policy. I always see the science as a good check on policies, because scientists can have, from another point of view, we are always arguing that scientists should do more to inform the policymakers. And I think it's a bit unfair, because what we want from scientists is to do excellent science. And now we also want them to be influencers. It's kind of too much, I have friends that are top scientists in my country, and they are really not people person. They are really good in research in their particular field. But if we want them to do, okay, so you do soil research, please go convince your policymaker, not going to happen. So we need really to create bridge between science and policy. And actually, I don't think it's the scientist's obligation to do this, because they need to be good in science, So we need we need this bridge between science and policy to communicate science better, and to communicate science better to population, because every politician will tell you that he is responsible to his electorate, and sorry, to his electors, to his voters. So what does it mean is that first, before you convince policymaker, you also need, up to some degree, convince the population.
Yeah.
And this was my third take, and this is the merchants of doubt. Because as you mentioned, Luke, during history, we have seen it several times. You mentioned asbest, but I would mention smoking, dangerous chemicals, even the climate change, of course. There is a high demand of status quo not to be changed, and there is a high demand of people who have investment and who are interested in maintaining status quo in terms of pollution to sell you doubts. And it's quite effective tactics, to be fair. And nowadays with social media and with wide outreach, you don't need to be accountable to anyone to pretty much have millions of followers, and you can spill anything you want in the social network. It's more relevant than before, and this goes back to my previous point. We need to create effective bridge between policy and science, because otherwise the merchants of doubt will prevail. That's my final. Thank you.
Thanks, Miroslav. There was a lot in this, and also very provocative, and I think there's no use in having too much rechewing other discussions, and it's good to bring things to the table that can be, I think, also uncomfortable. This is provocative and uncomfortable, or close when you discuss. I think growing population is an element, of course, that is to be seen in the whole picture. But I think it's also to do with the people, the current people. Even if population growth would stop at this very moment, there's still a lot of people that have to go for their fair share. And then the question is, what is the fair share? And that is a very long debate. But the fair share means some will have more and some will have less. And that is a very difficult discussion on redistribution, which is ultimately pinning down on consumption. And that is then we're again pinning down on the pollution. So it's a big social challenge. It's not a linear problem. You said it as well. And then finally, one thing that I really picked up is that the scientists should not be responsible for the communication. I would tend to agree, but if you have some scientists that are a little bit less scientists when they communicate, it's definitely helpful because they have the credibility and they are the ones that did the science, and therefore they can speak with the full authority. But it's true, we cannot put the full responsibility there, and we need translators from science to policy and to help both, actually, between the bridge between science and policymakers. Patricia, over to you as a final introductory remarks. I think there's a lot been said already. So I'm very curious to see what angle you will add now. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Luc, and good morning, everyone. I'm Patricia, and I represent the European Environmental Bureau. We're the largest federation of citizens' environmental organizations in Europe. So while listening to you, I wanted to share a few thoughts about the advances, but also the threats that we have seen in Europe to pollution policies at the moment, and also how that relates to Europe's role in environmental multilateralism and our global responsibility. So as has been mentioned before, from a European perspective, we can say that a lot has been done at the level of legislation to curb pollution, to reduce health impacts. Yet severe pollution problems persist, despite science showing us clearly what the impacts are on the environment and human health. So what are the main hindrances for us to act upon science? Under the current situation, we're seeing one thing again very clearly. We have a war raging in Europe, we have an energy crisis, we have sanctions, we have supply chain disruptions, we have a global food crisis, and corporate lobby groups are pushing back even more against better protection, against pollution, trying to use the argument of a difficult economic situation to delay environmental and health protections. And they even do that where, you know, the potential impact on their sectors would only kick in 5 years from now or more. So what we need to do is that where we have clear science showing us what the environmental and human health impact is, we need to progress with better protections, and we need to keep focus on long-term objectives such as the zero pollution ambition. I would like to illustrate that current scenario with two examples. One is around chemicals. So as you know, the EU chemicals regulation REACH is quite unparalleled internationally in its intent to regulate the market access of chemicals. We've seen some progress, but at the same time, the processes for phase outs and substitution those processes are very, very slow. And the European Commission has promised to strengthen chemical regulation. What we also see is when we look at science, that we still have serious knowledge gaps when it comes to chemicals. The chemical industry is faster in introducing hundreds and thousands of new chemicals, and research can hardly catch up. Now, anyways, the Commission has promised to strengthen REACH. Now, what we have just seen a few weeks ago is that they have now taken it off their work program for next year, delaying this urgent review of chemical regulation for at least a year and pushing it into very uncertain territory beyond the current Commission's political mandate. Now, one of the guiding questions of this conference is how to avoid interest groups in determining conclusions in the international arena. Well, I would argue, just as we keep the tobacco industry out from regulating human health, we need to keep out the chemical industry from shaping the regulation of chemicals. And what is currently happening is a very good example how one interest group, a very powerful interest group, seeks to slow down progress to protect the environment and human health from pollution. And with REACH, the EU, of course, also has a global effect through our global supply chains. The regulation of products reaching the European market can have a positive knock-on effect globally. And the second example is very much linked to that. It's also from the chemicals arena around the use of chemical pesticides. So also here we have seen or heard a promise that we will review the directive on the sustainable use of pesticides. And here we are fighting for legally binding reduction targets for the use of chemical pesticides, especially hazardous pesticides, where research has not only shown the negative impact on human health and the environment, but where research has also shown that from an economic perspective, society pays twice as much for the effects of pesticides than the chemical industry makes in terms of profits. So also from a financial point of view, reducing chemical pesticides use makes a lot of sense. And research led by the French National Research Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment has also shown that we can reduce the use of chemical pesticides in Europe by 50%. Only by applying integrated pest management. And yet policymakers keep repeating that such a reduction was not possible. So very similar to discussion that we see around chemicals regulation and REACH, this comes at a moment where certain lobby groups are using Russia's war in Ukraine to try to derail our zero pollution objectives and the objective to halve the use of chemical pesticides. And my last point is, and that's linked to the pesticides, there we also have a very clear global responsibility as Europeans. Numerous pesticides and hazardous chemicals are banned in the EU to protect our human health and the environment here in Europe. And yet the very same products are produced and exported by European companies to third countries where safety regulations are much weaker and less strictly implemented. So in 2018, recent research has shown more than 81,000 tons of pesticides that are banned, currently banned, with 41 different substances on European fields, were exported for use in the Global South. So the Commission has promised in 2020 that we're going to stop this practice of intoxicating the rest of the world. But until now, we do not see any concrete plan, for instance, in its work plan next year, to put forward a proposal of how we're going to implement that export ban. We're actually meeting the Environment Commissioner tomorrow to hand over a petition that has been signed by more than 200,000 citizens in Europe who would like to see an export ban implemented. And looking back at multilateralism, we need the European Union to push for an international treaty on hazardous pesticides, but that's not going to be credible as long as we export banned substances. So to sum up, in the area of chemicals and pesticides, we do need more research on the environment and health impact. This research needs to drive the phase out and substitution of chemicals, and where there are no clear results from science yet, we need to apply the precautionary principle, which in theory is anchored in European environmental lawmaking, but then not applied in practice. And in order to make sure science can inform and then shape environmental policies, our governance systems also need to reduce the impact that corporate lobbies can have on pollution prevention policies. I'll leave it there for now, but I'd be glad to talk about other pollution aspects as well in the discussion.
Thanks, Patricia. And indeed, quite a few elements added to the equation now. And I think one of the important parts, and you were actually the first to mention, the current effect of the war, and therefore then the energy crisis, and that changing the narrative in Europe at the moment on many things, except for going for energy independence, of course, where we see, of course, an acceleration just because of the need. We even have, for the first time, a discussion on sufficiency in Europe when it comes to energy use, not just efficiency. So, I mean, even though horrible what's going on, that is an element that can be positive. But yes, one sees the forces in this context of the pollution. Also in the nature files, we see that there is pressure to slow down because it's not the immediate urgency in the current new context that we're unfortunately in. And that, of course, is a danger. And I think then again, it's about making sure that the right information is in the right place and that the policymakers are indeed having the good arguments to counter any counter arguments that are not fair. And I remember one very important point that you made, and I think that's what, when we translate science to the decision makers or to the public, because that was what Miroslav said, if the public is with us and your petition hopefully has the effect that we need, the petition that you will share with the commissioner, because that's when the public speaks, that does have an impact. But I think communicating is also to whom to communicate. And I think if the cases make very clear that the cost of effort to ban hazardous chemicals or hazardous pesticides is way lower than the cost to society, and that should ring many bells with the policymakers. And last point, and I think this could be food for our discussion as well, is it's the double export challenge. On the one hand, the export of those chemicals that are not allowed anymore in Europe, on the one hand, and the second, of course, having whatever we consume produced in countries causing pollution is an indirect export, if you like. And then finally, your point on import, would of course then would, if we would have someone from the World Trade Organization on this panel, would be an immediate interesting debate, I'm sure. But that's where often the excuse then comes, this protectionist element. So that is a lot of information. I'm trying to see now if we have questions from our participants. As far as I can see, that is not yet the case. It may still come.
Hi, look, can I?
But I would like to offer the panelists to make a comment or a question to their colleagues. Please, Maria, go ahead.
Thank you. And unfortunately, I have to leave you soon, so that's why I'm taking advantage of the opportunity. Thank you so much. Several reactions. Look, I think the discussion is extremely interesting, and definitely we are all aligned in the same approach. I mean, we need to reach this zero pollution. Just to remind all of us that zero pollution for the public health community will represent 100% health So we cannot be more happy to move into that road of reaching zero pollution. The question, there are two questions: the level of ambition to reach that zero pollution and the speed. So just to again, another element: the more ambitious you are, we need to on accelerating this road to zero pollution, the more lives you are going to save. So again, I'm bringing here the way of measuring our success by the public health, I mean the health benefits that we are generating, how many lives we are saving. One point of Miroslav, I fully agree with you. I'm a medical doctor by training, and we tend to be very pragmatic. I mean, you have your patient in front of you, and your patient is bleeding. So you need to take some intervention. So probably you will concentrate your action on where you can have a better and quicker response and then protection of the patient. So here is clear that we need to stop the bleeding, the hemorrhage. And the best way to do it, and it's a non-regret interventions, will be to accelerate the transition to renewable clean sources of energy. It seems to me that this is the best way to stop the hemorrhage that our patient is having at the moment. It's a non-regrets intervention. Is from a financial point of view, and this goes to the last intervention, is perfectly aligned with the society economic benefits we can make. It will be good for the environment. It will be good for creating jobs. So my question is, what are we waiting for? So essentially, second, non-regrets interventions, stop giving subsidies to fossil fuels industry and use those subsidies for making sure that we fix other parts of our patient that are very much needed, and the rehabilitation that our patient is going to need at the moment. I like very much your reference to the feedback, because this is very much on the medical training as well. When you fix something on the human body, you will create some disadjustments in other parts. So you need to have this holistic approach. And as you rightly say, not everything is linear. So we need to concentrate on the interventions of maximum impact that has been proved that will have maximum benefits, no regrets. And if we can bring the economic argument, the financial argument, even better. My last point on citizens and communication. For us on air pollution and impact on human health, there is one word that has changed our life completely. The word is asthma. And why? Because the linkages between exposure to air pollution and asthma are so obvious, so visible for our citizens, for our population, that the pressure on politicians has been created. So clearly, in terms of communication, on linking the real aspects of pollution, the exposure to pollution, to human health, and more importantly, how much we can put it in positive, how much we can describe those benefits. It's saying, if you tackle the causes of climate change, one of the benefits will be reduction of exposure to polluted, toxic air, and then your lungs will be immediately benefiting from that. So the more we use a positive language, I think our citizens are getting fed up of apocalyptic news, and we are all contributing to this apocalypse. And the risk of that is that at one point you get paralyzed and you say, okay, if there is nothing I can do, okay, fine. I mean, let's enjoy and carpe diem, you know. So we need to provide some good arguments for our citizens to be motivated, to put pressure on our politicians to maintain that intensity, and making sure that their reactions will be at the level of the magnitude of the problem we are dealing with, which is huge. And thank you so much. This has been a very interesting dialogue for the time being. I'm sure it will be even more now. Thanks.
Thanks, Maria. And as I understood now, you're going to leave us. But thanks for your contribution. And I think, again, you delivered another line of food for thinking about these no regret measures and why we don't even get these no regret measures through. And the COP27, unfortunately, being a huge example of that. And of course, this link to asthma is also, I think, something that speaks to the people. And as you rightfully say, we need this message of hope of what can be done, and to be able to motivate people and not get them paralyzed by this, the huge challenge in front of us, and not being apocalyptic. I fully agree with that. I'm now, well, if you left, when you leave us, Maria, it's fine. And then you can stay on, of course. We'd love for you to stay on, but I understood you had to leave for another obligation. So thanks so much. Alphonse, you were the first speaker today, and I'm hoping that you might have some questions to the panelists, or even some comments, or maybe even a provocative reflection from the youth perspective, because ultimately everything that we are trying to do is for the next generations, more than for the current one even. Is there anything that you would like to comment on?
Thank you so much, Luke. And it has been really thought-provoking to listen to very excellent experts in all these fields. Of course, with common concern about how we can tame the pollution. And just as Maria said, it's not a rocket science to understand that we have impacted all this and of course caused a lot of pollution, more specifically because of our reliance to fossil fuels, and that's why I mean that's the only thing that we must do to transition to I mean to place the planet on a path to a more resilient sort of way. Another thing is that is coming out quite clearly is on it sends me to think about a certain report that was called Limits to Growth, something like that. I think it was released in early 70s. And one of the reasons as to why politicians really like, you know, get it wrong many times is because of the parameters that are being used to measure progress. And this includes like a growth in GDP and things like those. And then every politician just wants that because it's what is visible and in a very short time to the electorate. If we can include more parameters in the measure of growth, not just like limiting ourselves to economic perspective of it, then I think we will be doing a lot of justice to ourselves, to the planet, and to the rest of the people. Because once we just, you know, like, of course, I mean, just crush ourselves through within the limits of improving our development in terms of GDP and not anything else, then that means we'll be making a lot of impact to the planet. And that's why I think the multilateral system has been very, very slow moving in my view. So just that. And another thing, I fully agree with you, Luke Bass, that it will be so unwise that we fail to include youth in very important conversations. I think it was even in Agenda 21 document, more precisely the chapter 25 of it, that young people need to be included in national delegations to international meetings, but not just that, very important for them to be present in key decision-making processes, but also like in every discussion that touches around their future. So we can't be pushing for the future without having the future's voice itself.
Yeah.
So I think I really want to thank you and the Czech Republic of the European Council, UNEP, and every other actor present here for ensuring that youth have a voice, and especially youth from developing countries in this case, because most of the times they are really underprivileged, underserved, and it's very important to hear their insights in every conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alphonse, and thank you so much for two big reminders I think that you brought up. One is that this very old report that was written way before any of the youth was born is still being picked up and looked at. It was also scientists producing it, the Limits to Growth. It has been attacked on many fronts, but I think it still stands, and the Club of Rome is still producing interesting work on this aspect. And the second point, and I think that is hugely important, is that the youth is becoming the real stakeholders, have a augmented role in the discussions, because it's often more at the observer side than at the real impact side, and it's something to reflect on in the whole, I think, multilateralism. It's definitely when it comes to these future-oriented multilateral agreements. How that would to be functioned, I would look rather to the UN itself and to see what ideas could emerge from there to even further involve youth more. As far as I'm informed, there's still no question from the audience, although we have about, I think, 70 except for the panel, so 70 additional participants that are hopefully listening carefully. We haven't any dropped off since the beginning, so that's a good sign. I'm looking at the numbers there, so that's okay. But I'm sure, and I know that everybody was trying to keep to time, so I'm sure you still have another breath to make a comment or to make a reflection of what you've heard from your colleagues in the panel. Does anyone would like to come in?
Yeah, if I may, Luke.
Andrea.
From the panelists, and I'd also like to ask a question of Miroslav as well. So firstly, I'm of the view that from a global standpoint, in terms of pollution, and particularly invisible pollution, i.e. pharmaceuticals, some of the new PFAS, all of those types of substances, all of the pesticides, fertilizers, many of them are invisible, and therefore communities and politicians therefore have great difficulties actually taking up that information. And then when you try and look for the information at a global level to influence, to say what's actually happening with regard to trends in some of these substances, the information's not there. Now, we know that there are an enormous number of researchers globally who are actually doing work in this area, and I guess it's a question for our panelists. How do we actually get those researchers to put the data into a form where at the global level we can handle that? The other part of that is the communication space. So I don't agree that I do agree and I don't agree. So some scientists should never be allowed to communicate. Okay, and I'm being very kind. I love scientists, of course, because I'm one myself. But I do think that science can only be useful if we communicate it effectively and in different ways, depending on who needs to receive that information. So I actually think the scientific community needs to get a lot better at how we communicate these issues so policymakers and so communities can advocate for the policies and the legislation, etc., that we need. So, and in order to do that, we need that big database of information to help support that communication. And, you know, at the beginning, I provided that, you know, cherry picking issues. And I just picked up a few issues just to outline. But when you actually start getting into it, and the European Union and organizations within Europe, the REACH program, etc., you've got fabulous databases, etc., but we don't for many other parts of the world, and we don't for particular classes of substances as well. So I guess there's two components of that. It's actually establishing that scientific database, but also that communication piece. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, Andrea. And I think that's in the context of where there is more knowledge that is not yet reached the surface, is especially in that space. So that's I think an opportunity, but it's also, and hopefully this science policy panel that is now being kicked off will actually contribute to this. So that's some hope on that front. So so thanks. I'm just looking at please raise your hand. I'm not sure if there's this function on the machine.
I don't see the function.
I can see your hand, so show me your hands if you want to come in. Huh? Miroslav, please go ahead, and then
yes, my name has been evoked several times during the previous conversation, so I would like to speak.
That's what they call being provocative.
Yes, that was deliberate, actually. No, but first, I would like to clarify what was my mention about the scientist and communication, and it was very much in line what you said, Luke, that they really should be helped. Of course, there are some scientists that are better in communication than the others. That's for sure. But I said it generally, you know, because I consider myself scientist a bit as well to deflect the blame from scientific community. You know, you haven't warned us enough, and it's generally not their job. But I think it has been cleared, so I put that on the side that science needs to help to communicate. I would very much like to thank Andrea that she mentioned these invisible pesticides. I wanted to talk about them as well. Pollutants. I want to talk about them as well, but as you mentioned, the PFAS, big issue happening all around Europe. This is actually a good example of communication, because one of our top scientists, if not the top scientist on PFAS pollution in our country, just yesterday had a whole opening article in one of our biggest newspaper about PFAS found in fishes from very much spring of the river to end of the Elbe in the so it's really gathering momentum in mainstream media. If it's but he was not communicating his science, you know, he communicated something that people can understand: pollution and fishes, and that's a nice wrap up around the pollution problem. And we will face another pollution, we call it emerging environmental issues, because there is another type of pollution. We haven't spoke about it yet, but it has characteristic of pollution, and another provocative, and it is a genome pollution. We recently, I've been recently on conference on gene drive technology and and gene editing. And the idea came to me that actually some genome manipulation and gene drives combined can create some sort of nonlinear source of pollution. Like if you change the genome of one species to propagate, you know, to get some harmful attributes of the species away, like we tackling malaria, so we introduce some genes into Anopheles and it spreads because you design it to spread in the population, to exchange whole genome of whole population of mosquitoes. Well, it has characteristic of pollution, and it's nonlinear because you just put few of them and it spreads. So it's we're living in really interesting times where many times we are 2 steps back behind the technology. We are definitely 2 steps back in chemicals. Because there is so many of them, and we regulate about 100,000 of them, and then there is a plethora of variants that are really going under our radar. And another issue with chemical pollution is that we are monitoring singular compounds, but we have a hell of a little information about the cocktail we are, for example, creating in our soil, and how these chemicals interact on short-term and long-term basis. So this is another box of worms. You know, I'm opening provocatively here.
Yeah, we need some good worms in the soil for sure. Then we know that things are better. Miroslav, you're adding another layer of necessary complexity indeed. It's just confirming your point on the linear solutions that often go wrong. I give you one example in Belgium. It may have happened in other countries. There was a tax benefit for diesel cars because they had less CO2 emissions, and so now Belgium is still stuck with too many diesel cars. And you can bet, of course, that's not good for air pollution. So that was a very linear policy proposal in Belgium that has now been undone, but the damage is done already. So just a very simple example that is quite unbelievable that it actually ever came through. Another point very quickly, Miroslav, is that you talked about the growth of population. There is also something in the scientist world is the growth of publications. And that being a self-fulfilling prophecy in the academic world, because you have to produce your publications, and therefore once a publication is then done, there is not a follow-up to make the publication having a real effect, because you're already working on the next publication. Just a little bit in the scientist and in the academic world perspective, it can sometimes be a challenge. But again, I think we agree that some scientists are really good communicators, some can become even better, and some just don't have to do it as a point of conclusion here. Joachim, I know that you wanted to come in.
Yes, thank you. I had a couple of thoughts reacting on previous speakers and also maybe a question then to the others. First of all, Maria Neva mentioned asthma. One thing that I think will become also very powerful as we see emerging science is the link between environmental factors and also pollution to mental health. So mental health, I think, is becoming a bigger issue. Our president has also announced that we're going to work more on this. And I think that's going to be another element that could be very powerful in terms of making the case that it's, you know, we're creating so many problems by doing certain things that you know, that we can help, that can help hopefully to convince those who are not yet convinced. The second point I wanted to make is that I think it's not so much about discussion whether scientists have to do communication or not, or whether politicians have to be more scientific or something like that. I think sometimes we probably just don't recognize the role of the communicators. It's a role in itself. And a lot of people are doing that voluntarily or by definition as it's their job description. And others are doing it because they're simply good at it. And I think we should be more, how you say, grateful for those and be more respecting those talents, because I think that is really what is needed, the communication in both directions. It's not only a one-directional communication from the scientists, so to say, to politicians. I think it goes also the other way around. I mean, what do we need from science? I mean, we have a lot of evidence, as we said, but sometimes it's so fragmented or so complex that it's not easy to draw the right conclusions. We saw that in COVID, in the discussions about what are the best measures and actions to take, that politicians were trying to listen to science, at least some of them were, or most of them were. But of course, they didn't get a clear answer of what exactly now the best measure would be, because we wouldn't really able to tell at that moment. So I think these communicators are extremely powerful, and I want to just give one example, that the whole question of plastics pollution became so prominent when a number of factors came together. We had the science in place more and more since more than 10 years now. I'm aware of the topic. We had the awareness raising that was going on, and solutions slowly emerged. But it really took off, I think, when it reached the broad media and it reached the wider public. Yeah, with a couple of documentaries and a couple of really telling stories that was so obvious that nobody wants plastics in the sea. I mean, nobody wants to go on holiday and dive in an ocean of plastic instead of an ocean of fish. So for me, I think that we have to also recognize these success stories and how these ingredients come together to then make the necessary change that is needed. And that's why I wanted to throw out a little bit to the panel, to you, Luc, and to the others. I mean, the dilemma sometimes is also at the global level. We have so many initiatives, so many things going on, and so many knowledge gathering exercises. And when you look at the climate agenda or the biodiversity agenda, I think for me, a game changer was the creation of the intergovernmental panels for climate change, for example, the IPCC, yeah. Because it helped to digest all of this vast amount of scientific knowledge, have a consensual discussion, and with a close to 100% consensus, then communicate very clear, solid science that was the basis for further discussions. This is a huge opportunity for the science policy panel that is now being created on waste, chemicals, and pollution. But what do we want from it? They have so many things they could potentially do. Yeah, I mean, it's such a big area. So are we clear what we want from them, what we expect from such a panel, and to make it that interface that we need between the science world and the policy world? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna park that last one for Andrea to respond later, because I think she must be quite eager to do so. But I wanted to comment on your element, mental health as an extra layer of argumentation, which then even combines with what has been proven is to have enough nature available even for mental health benefits. And so there's another connection there into the biodiversity sphere. And then the role of communicators. And that, I think, is something that in the projects or in the research projects or even in the European projects, the ones that I've seen, it always comes at the end. And there's also a little bit left for the communication. There's a lot of research, a lot of work But then on the communication, it's always the crumbles of the budget of the project. That is something that could fundamentally change and support that communication about what's going on. Patricia, I'm sure you want to come in for a final word, and then I think I'm not pushing Andrea, but I would think she would like to respond on the science policy panel and the hopes for it, and then I'll try to wrap up. I hope that's okay with everyone. So Patricia, over to you.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I also wanted to come in to comment on a few things that have been said with regards to the ongoing discussions on the international, the Global Plastics Treaty. And I agree with what Joachim has just said about this being a very good example of how strong science, campaigning, the work of journalists have all come together to very successfully and actually quite rapidly put this issue on the global agenda, because also before we had all these very good scientific reports, ranging from microplastics, the effect of microplastics, to the effect of marine litter. Before we had that science, plastics pollution was also often a very invisible pollution, at least the one that ends up in the seas, and the ones that end up in our blood, because we don't see the microplastics in our blood. So I think it's a very strong example of how strong science, well-communicated science working together with campaigners, science working together with journalists can be very successful in putting a global environmental issue on the agenda really quickly and really effectively. So that's a success story. But now, if we're looking at the ongoing negotiations which are taking place today and this week in Uruguay, the question, a remaining question is, how can we make sure that then once we move from agenda setting to regulating and to legislating, how can we ensure a strong role for the voice of science also, in the face of negotiations? Because what we see now is that, of course, we have, a lot of different interests represented by the different governments, but we also see, again, and going back to my previous point, that what we see at the European level at the moment, again, very strongly, is that the voice of industry is, again, very, very strong. So we have mostly the petrochemical industry who is trying to shape the outcome of the negotiations, and trying to make sure that the treaty does not address the production phase too clearly, even though we all know that it's the production phase which is crucial, where we can regulate what kind of toxic polymers can be put on the market, what kind of toxic additives can be put on the market. So the question remains, how can we strengthen the role of science also once we come to legislation? And I agree with you that the setup of the science policy panel on pollution is extremely important, and we all hope it will be able to play a similar role to the IPCC, which, I agree with you, is a great example of how scientists can become a decisive voice in the debate. But at the same time, we also have to make sure that we don't only put scientists, in science policy panels at the side of negotiations, but how can we give them a more crucial role at the negotiation table? I don't have an answer for that. It's just a question that comes to mind following what my comments are commenting from the negotiations in Uruguay.
Okay. Well, thanks. The clear call for another stakeholder to have a bit more impact, as with youth, as we said earlier, with youth, to have some real role and a clear mandate to be involved in shaping all of this. And yes, you repeat your point, and I think we can all see that in many ways that there is interest groups that are indeed trying to prevent the necessary action. Without pointing to any specific, I'm not doing it now as a moderator, but it has to be mentioned. I have a few wrap-up points, but as I promised, I wanted Andrea to respond just before I will wrap up, and to whatever you want, Andrea, of course, but I'm sure you were triggered by the discussions on the science policy panel.
Be really quick. I'd like to respond to lots of the comments made. I completely agree with Patricia too about having the scientists in the room with the negotiators to actually help that interface occur. But the Open-ended Working Group meeting in Bangkok in January will actually focus on scope and function. And so at the moment, because it's an intergovernmental process, the scope at the moment, because of its title, the sound management of chemicals and waste and prevention of pollution, is massive. And so one of the risks of a panel like this is that it's too broad to enable good focus. My personal view is, though, one of the great things this panel could do is actually establish procedures for where you actually focus efforts based on the science, which means you need to have that rigorous science process to be able to prioritise, to say, well, actually, we've got a lot of science on this, but we haven't got implementation of air pollution standards, for example, or we've got a lot of we don't have much on pharmaceuticals, but we actually are seeing ecosystem impacts at very low levels of pharmaceuticals in water bodies, for example. So where do we focus our efforts? So I guess I'm hopeful that when those discussions take place, that there will be a discussion about some of that ability to undertake horizon scanning and to be able to prioritise actions and to provide advice, because as we said at the outset, many of these issues are not the same across the globe. There are different issues in different parts of the world that will need different attention. So how do we actually accommodate, and how does science then help inform those regional and national perspectives? So I haven't completely answered your question because it is a governmental process and they will be undertaking that process. I hope to be there though, and actually sitting there to be able to observe and input where possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks to everyone for what I at least found a really interesting discussion, and I hope I'm joined by others. There have been quite a lot of reflections here. I hope to also see them reflected in the report that I understand the UNEP office would produce. There's a lot of good material here. There's some provocative elements which are hopefully going to be saved in that report and to make decision makers also think and to prepare. Some reminders, some success stories, and the one mentioned by Joachim, I think, on marine litter, and getting that into the media and then seeing that translated in what I remember a few years ago when I talked to the Commission, Joachim, with your colleagues, I think 6-7 years ago, when we mentioned from ICN this potential convention on plastic pollution, it was seen as completely politically impossible, and see now where we are. We are discussing it actually in concreto after the UNEA, which is amazing and positive. Many challenges remain, as mentioned already, looking into the bigger consumption patterns, the growth that we see, mentioned also by Alphonse, of GDP as a goal in itself, and also the even add-on challenge from population that Miroslav mentioned. It's a big social issue within countries. This pollution issue, it is within countries between the haves and the have-nots. It's within Europe, and the maps that the European Environment Agency provides on this are clear. Where the per capita income is lower, you can see that the pollution effects are higher in many ways, in many of the pollutants that we see. And then, let alone in the world, there is challenges with export directly of these products, but also indirectly because of the consumption. Let's say in the developed countries. All things to tackle. A big hope on this science policy panel to reach a level of where things come together in a similar way at some point in the future. I'm very careful how to express myself, but we talked about IPBES, we talk about IRP, we talk about the IPCC, hoping that then this panel may at some point reach a similar impact as well. With that, I hope I did wrap it up correctly. I'm going to misuse the opportunity to announce what Joachim said. On the 14th of December, there's a good event in Brussels presenting this zero pollution report that the agency, European Environment Agency with the JRC and in collaboration with the Commission has been producing. So that will be, it's launched next week, but the event will be on the 14th. And then, of course, let's hope that even the discussions and we haven't mentioned it yet, but the Convention on Biodiversity discussions are, as some people call it, there should be a Paris moment. Let's hope it is successful, and it also includes the interlinkages with the pollution agenda in what is coming in the next 2 weeks. Thanks very much. Looking forward to a continued exchange, looking forward to the report, and I would say, at least for those that can do it virtually, a little hand or a big hand for the panel. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you in person very soon again. Goodbye. Oh, there is a
Bye-bye.
So I think colleagues from the Geneva Environment Network would like to maybe say a final word on the what's next element. But by now, I think the panel is finished. Thank you so much. Goodbye, Andrea, Alphonse, Joachim, Miroslav, Tricia.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to all, and thank you for you, Luc, to moderate this session very efficiently. And hope to see you at some of the events that are now announced on the screen. And just to flag that at the same time you're having the discussion in Brussels and this interesting event that you have shared in the chat, Joachim, there is in Geneva an event organized by our colleagues from the UN Economic Commission for Europe. It's a global workshop on source-to-sea management. It's from 14 to 16 December, where a lot of these topics will also be discussed, and our colleagues from the United Nations Environment Programme are also very much involved, and many of the other actors that you have mentioned throughout this event. This event is organized by the Water Convention of the UN Economic Commission for Europe. Thank you all.